You good? Okay. All right. Don't be shy. Come on up to the front. There's seats up here. Hopefully everybody's enjoying the summit. I actually just got here like an hour and a half ago. It was a whirlwind this morning. Drop off the kids, go to the airport, fly to Denver. I'm Cameron Cedar. I'm a technology strategist for SUSE, and that kind of means several different things. I'm one of the Ceph architects. I work on the Ceph storage, but that's not the only thing. I also work with OpenStack, a lot of our advanced technology in containers, things with Kubernetes, and a lot of our logging and monitoring stuff that we're starting to do work on, and all the fun and exciting, cool things. So hopefully I can share some things that are valuable for everybody here. I'm glad that everybody came here. It looks like there's a nice crowd. And hopefully you're interested in what the ELK Stack can really offer for you in your Ceph cluster. There's some really powerful things you can do with it. Ceph is awesome. I've been working with Ceph for many years. At SUSE, I'm one of the experts there. I don't know everything about it, but I do know a fair amount. What was very exciting last year was the introduction of the Ceph Foundation, underneath, of course, of the Linux Foundation. Ceph is moving really rapidly. So is hardware. And that's another exciting thing with Ceph, is that pairing it up with the right hardware, there's some really neat things you can do now to really speed things up, make things much more scalable. It's super exciting space to be in. If you are not running Ceph, you should be somewhere in your environment today. So Ceph and logging. There's a lot of logs that you can gather, especially if you have a petabyte plus of storage in your environment and you're running a Ceph cluster. This is going to be a problem, and you need to be able to manage that. If you're running multi-petabyte scale with Ceph, you need a way to capture the logs, capture everything correctly, be able to act upon things that you're logging, and know exactly what to do with that. And that's really the crux of what we're going to be really talking about today, is really getting behind that and really attacking that so that it can be beneficial for you. So on a Linux system itself, of course, you have our syslog, or maybe you have syslog-ng. There's many different ways of gathering logs. But you want to forward those logs to something that you're going to aggregate those logs to. Could be Logstash. In my experience, Logstash, can be a little bit hard for some in its configuration. Dealing with the way that you configure Logstash and some of its its log aggregating, some of its forwarding of logs can really be a little bit difficult. So I suggest really looking at Fluent Bit, which is a little bit like Fluent D, but much easier to use, much more scalable. So take a look at both if you're really evaluating this. So instead of an ELK stack, you might really have an ELK stack in the end. FileBeat, another log forwarder. You can forward to Elasticsearch. and allows you to take care of those logs in Elasticsearch. Ceph also has what we call gray log support. Have you heard of gray log? Some of you have heard of gray log. That's awesome. Really neat technology. It's really, what I found, it's really one of the only open source logging systems out there that does a really awesome job in the open source world. Really does well against things like Splunk, but actually adds a lot more when it comes to logging. These guys are kind of laughing up here. But it has a special format called the GELF format, and which is Graylog extended logging format. And that format, it actually is part of Ceph. You can actually change your Ceph comp file and actually output your Ceph logs to a GELF format to a Graylog server. So that's very convenient. But it's important to store logs for later use, also analyzing those logs for alerting, making sure that you're getting everything you need out of your Ceph cluster to figure out really what's going on, especially at petabyte scale. And then, of course, in the end, maybe you'll want to do some analyzing of that data, maybe with some type of machine learning, Microsoft's R client that it's free as well. XPack, part of the Elastic Stack there for machine learning. You can tie that into it as well. You can really kind of grow this thing, and I'm not going to show you the extended side to it, but I'll really just show you the front end side of the logging aspect, but you can really grow it. And then, of course, troubleshooting becomes a big part of this when you have a cluster up and running, allowing you to do some post-mortem. If really something does go badly wrong, you can find out what's going on. Forwarding logs, this is going to be an important piece early on when you tie in your logging. Formatting them properly. That's going to be an important aspect of it, especially for system logs. Not so much if you're using Graylog for Ceph. That's going to give you the best path to formatting your logs properly. Logstash has a lot of pipeline input models there, so you can use its syslog capabilities. It also has Graylog capabilities, so it will take the Graylog format as well. Fluent Bit also supports those as well. And then, of course, using FileBeat. So let's talk a little bit about Ceph GELF. Here's some of the parameters that you might use in your ceph.conf. Log to Graylog, and then the host and port. Pretty simple. Of course, making sure that you push that out to all of your cluster nodes, making sure that you have a way to do that. SUSE Enterprise Storage has a simple way with Salt, being able to update that from its administration piece there, and then pushing that out to your multi-petabyte cluster. Makes it super simple. Restarting your Ceph services, and then, of course, Deep C is that underlying layer for SUSE Enterprise Storage with Salt. That is the Salt-based tool for managing that. And these are the commands that you would use to make that super simple. Going from there, you want to parse and manage. So you've exported your logs. Now what do we do with it? So Logstash provides different methods to parse those logs. It gives you simple alerting. Could be done with Logstash, could be done, even with Cabana, you have some alerting capabilities. Graylog has alerting capabilities. So I'm going to a few more plugs on Graylog because of its alerting capabilities. Once you have that format in the GELF format and you're pushing that to Graylog, you can then take some of those logs. If you identify things within your logs that you see as maybe something as problematic or something that is approaching something where it's going to be problematic, you can watch for those with Graylog and send alerts. Not just alerts to an email, but also to things like Rocket Chat or Slack or whatever you have set up in your environment. Alerting the proper Ceph storage team or storage team in your environment to take care of or look at that issue. In Logstash, you'll want to use Grok. It's a special formatting within Logstash that gives you the ability to add in special fields and create what you want, so that's exported into Elasticsearch. You'll want to do that. That's just the Logstash way. You don't have to do that with Graylog. So another plug on Graylog, it makes it easier. So if you want to do it the hard way with Logstash, go right ahead. But you'll want to go through and format that properly. So you have to know what the fields are, that are coming from your Ceph cluster. So you want to format that properly before it hits your Elasticsearch environment, so it's properly indexing things. So that can take a little bit of time. So if you're not used to that, it might take you some time to figure that out. And get that working properly. Here's an example. This is a filter example for Logstash. With Graylog, you don't have to deal with this special formatting. So this is really just taking special timestamps and converting those and just formatting the data properly, grabbing what you want. So the tools really comes down to this ELK Stack, the Fluent Bit or Fluent D. So if you're using Rook, maybe you want to use Fluent D, but also Fluent Bit has some container applications as well, so you can plug that in easily. I find Fluent Bit to work quite well in a containerized environment. And also Graylog, that'll work there as well in a containerized environment. So on the front end, you're going to be focusing on these particular tools. These are really going to give you everything that you need for logging when it comes to a Ceph cluster, and then some. When it comes to the Elasticsearch side, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and why that's important. But these are going to give you everything that you need. If you want to get into more AI ops, that's another another class here at OpenStack Summit. I'm sure it's somewhere. How do you get it? So ELK, you could also run it standalone. You could get it through Docker if you wanted to make it really quick and easy. Just do a Docker compose. If you want to stand up something really quick for your development needs. ELK's not hard to install. Some of the latest versions have really become quite easy. There's really minimal configuration options. It's not like setting up OpenStack. Very, very minimal options for the setup. EFK is really simple as well. There's also Helm charts if you're going to go containerized. Or you can install it on an individual cluster. What I find with the ELK stack or the EFK stack, if you plug in Graylog with the EFK stack and set up a cluster, you can really scale it out really nicely. So if you're aggregating a bunch of logs from a multi-petabyte cluster, it scales really well. Because it has Elasticsearch, you can spin up multiple nodes. You can spin up multiple nodes for MongoDB, for Graylog. Graylog scales quite well with multiple nodes. And then you just use Cabana on the back end for doing a lot of your visualization, if that's necessary in your environment. So scales really, really well. And then, of course, if you want to make something a little more converged in the future, which is something that SUSE is looking at, creating some Kubernetes and Ceph clusters more converged. You can look at putting this type of a cluster integrated with your Ceph cluster and running them both together on top of Kubernetes. So again, that would become a really powerful solution in the end. So that's something as a future technology that SUSE is looking at. Graylog, here is just a screenshot of really kind of the simple setup. Graylog has the ability to do TCP and UDP. When it comes down to it, UDP is much more powerful in this case because it's the transport layer across the network is not quite as complex, and so it makes it so that it doesn't really soak up or saturate your network as much, and you can tie in compression to it. So if you have really big logs, you can start compressing those logs with UDP. TCP doesn't support that in the Graylog area, but with UDP, you don't have to worry about timing and things of that nature, and with TCP you do. So I really suggest looking at the UDP side of things as an input for Graylog. It's much more powerful in the end. So you would select your inputs from Graylog and then define that input. Good, that didn't show up too small. You'd select your nodes, the title, put in the title, your binding address and port. And this is really where you're going to send your Graylogs from your Ceph cluster. So when you set up your ceph.conf, this is what you'd plug in, whatever's going to be used for that binding address. Or you could use what's here, the default 0000, and it will bind to any address on that server. Pretty simple setup. And then the outcome, of course, you're going to see those log messages coming through from Ceph. You're going to see OSD logs, you're going to see monitor logs, and you're really going to be able to understand what's going on cluster-wide. So instead of having to parse through and logging onto your monitor nodes and your OSD nodes, we're just running a Ceph -s or -w and just watching things. You can watch the logs here on Graylog and much more easily parse through those. Notice at the top you have an easy search bar. So you can plug in your search at the top and see exactly what you want to see just by a simple search across all of your logs. Much, much easier. Saves you a lot of time on a multi-petabyte scale. Cabana, on the other hand, is going to show you can do the log aggregation. I wouldn't suggest using Cabana for that. Unless you're going to really tie that into maybe some machine learning and then ultimately doing some alerting off of that. I really wouldn't suggest it for the logging aspect because Graylog does such an awesome job for that. I would suggest using Cabana specifically for aggregating some of your just creating some of your alerts, taking some of that elastic search capability and searching some of the metadata. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means on the Ceph side. So when it comes to object storage, searching through your metadata, being able to use Cabana with Elasticsearch to pull out that data. You can use Cabana for that. If you're using Logstash, you can use that to search your aggregated logs. But I find that Graylog is much easier to use because it has an easier search system. You don't have to use a query language in order to search your logs, whereas Cabana, you're using a search language. So here's a bit of a result that you might get for a Cabana search. This in particular is just searching for Rados Gateway. We got failed start on Rados Gateways. Just something that you could get out of that, just as an example. It could go further than that, of course. So to take a little bit different turn here with the ELK Stack, we just talked about the logging aspect. We're going to talk now about the Rados Gateway and object storage. The Rados Gateway does have a REST API. So you can easily plug that in to be utilized for the admin ops API, or there's the user API. There's a couple of things I don't really suggest using the admin API for, and I'll get into that, which is kind of really the motivation behind some of this. But the RESTful API is really used to access the object storage via S3, or you could possibly use Swift if that's something that you're used to, because Ceph does support both. From what I've seen, they're pretty close to being, almost the same with some of the APIs that are used in each one. You'll need to implement user accounts, ACLs, buckets in order to pull out the right information from the Rados Gateway for the metadata search. It supports, and I just talked about this, I'm getting ahead of myself. Lots of S3-like features, and they continuously are adding even more. It seems like with every release there's at least one more that's added. And there's some that are a little bit different than S3 as well when it comes to some of the geo clustering and geographic redundancy, multi-site. From the Joule release on, that's a capability that is there. And there's been some added things in Mimic as well. So Elasticsearch is part of the API there for the Rados Gateway. And you can plug into that. It's horizontally scalable, it's schemaless, it speaks REST, it's easy to configure, it's highly scalable. And really I think that's really why the Ceph team chose to go this route, is because it's so highly scalable. So the Rados Gateway metadata search, really the motivation behind this, your objects, you really need a way to search them. It's not like you have, it's not like it's a file system. You can't do a DU or a DF on it and get the size of your buckets and all that stuff. You can't really try to understand your data unless you have a way to search it. And with some recent releases, you also have the ability to create your own tagging in your metadata, so you can drop in your own tags when you are uploading objects or creating an object. Maybe you have an application that is written specifically for streaming videos, and you're tagging it with special tags in your application. So that gives you a way now to be able to pull out and search those special tags that you applied with the Elasticsearch capability. Some other motivation behind it. So we do have the admin API, which can really do a lot of stuff with your object storage, but it really was not written, for doing searches on your buckets, because really you're going to just be limited to a certain subset of bucket information. You're not going to be able to search all of those buckets that are created by specific users and or accounts within your object storage. So that's not going to be the direction you'll want to go. Although you can use it for operator level commands, and you can use it for operator type uses in your environment to be able to operate your gateway, your object storage, just using the API. If you wanted to specifically load up your system with a specific set of objects, sure, use the admin API. It makes it super easy, and you can program that. But as a storage admin, you might be interested in finding more out about your cluster, more about the average size of your object, the top 10 users, and the number of objects that are really being held on a specific user account, and really pulling out some of that special metadata that you've put in. That's what it really comes down to. So the design, it's built atop of the multi-site architecture within Ceph. If you're familiar with the Rados Gateway and its multi-site architecture, it's really built quite well, where you can now take that metadata and tier that data, so that once you create a tier in your multi-site configuration, you can actually tie that tier into your metadata, so that all of your metadata is being forwarded to that special tier for Elasticsearch. And so once that hits that special tier, your metadata hits that special tier, then you can send that off to, and the Rados Gateway will automatically do that once you have it configured. You set up the Rados Gateway, configure it for your Elasticsearch host, and it will start forwarding that metadata. Every time you create an object, takes its metadata and forwards that off to your Elasticsearch cluster. So then now that Elasticsearch data, all that metadata can then be searched and indexed, and you can pull out all that great information that's being stored there. On top of that, we now have other solutions now built in there with our Elastic Stack, with our Rados Gateway, to be able to also synchronize this data, not in a multi-site fashion locally, but now also to a public cloud. So you can create a separate tier that actually forwards off the data and the metadata to a public cloud as well. So that again makes it much more powerful of a solution. So if you wanted to plug that into a machine learning, in the Azure cloud, you could do that. You could start forwarding some of that data and that metadata from your Ceph cluster into a public cloud. And so you'd have a separate tier set up within your Ceph cluster to do that. Interesting use cases that could come out of that. So a little bit about the Elastic Sync plugin. It forwards metadata from other zones onto the Elasticsearch instance. It requires a read-only zone that doesn't cater to users' requests. All it does is forward to Elasticsearch. It doesn't require any off-the-shelf authentication module. You're just working directly with the Rados gateway. So, don't expose your Elasticsearch endpoint to the public. That can be a problem. Especially if you're setting it up on your, on your node that has Cabana, possibly. You might want to think about keeping those separated. In some cases, you might have it just all localized, but there will be cases where you have Cabana, where it's being publicly accessible, and you might have Elasticsearch on that host as well. So be careful how you're designing that in your environment. So user requests. For normal user requests, Rados Gateway itself can authenticate the user. So when this comes to creating buckets and those types of operations, ensures users don't see others' data. We also have an attribute mentioning owners of an object that's specifically used to service user requests. And then, of course, I mentioned the custom metadata fields. On a per user basis, you can create those metadata fields. When you are creating a bucket, you can create those custom metadata fields. And just to, create a diagram about it, if you like to look at things visually, this is really kind of the flow. You have a user that's making S3 requests. He's creating a bucket that has metadata tied with that, making that request directly to the Rados gateway, which then, of course, is back to the Ceph cluster. That metadata is shipped off directly to that other multi-site tier, and then off to Elasticsearch. So in this case, we're doing a synchronization with our Rados gateway service. Ceph now, in its latest release, has the ability to do also synchronization both ways when you're talking about multi-site. So the architecture is not hard. It's really quite a simple architecture. But it has lots of neat plugins in order for you to take advantage of the data that you have there. Example metadata. I'm sure you've seen this before. Nothing special here. Kind of cut off at the end. This one was a example of a video in an object. Here's an example query. So an Elasticsearch query that you might execute here. It's hitting the RGW gold realm in this particular case. So if you are setting up your Rados gateway with a realm of gold, and you have separate zones within that realm, and you're setting up that multi-site that way. You can do multi-site in a single realm and set up multiple zones for each site. Here he's just looking for the field meta size. So it's just a simple query. Of course, it could get quite large if you are searching for lots and lots of things, of course. And then the response back. I think that one got cut off a little bit too. and the response was a total of 22 on the size. There's also the chance of doing some really interesting queries. You can do put requests on specific time ranges, and then stats on objects from specific data or metadata, different content. You can index all that metadata on different strings or fields within Elasticsearch. So if you're familiar with Elasticsearch and you've used it quite a bit, you'll probably know how to do that. Build separate indexing for the separate fields within your cluster. And then, of course, doing that on a per bucket basis. So if you find that there's a specific need on one bucket to index a certain field, then of course you can run that through your Elasticsearch and set that up and begin receiving the graphing and the results through Cabana. That can be quite useful. So it can get a little complex on the Elasticsearch side, but you can see how this can be useful in your cluster to pull out the information that is there. Because on a multi-petabyte scale, this is absolutely needed. If all you're doing is object storage at a multi-petabyte scale, you need a proper way to search through this data and properly index it. When it comes to the logging support, Graylog also, of course, is going to provide you with all of the search capabilities, the alerting capabilities, and then, of course, being able to act upon those alerts is going to be much easier using Graylog on the logging side. Future work. I've mentioned just a few things already. That should be 7 instead of 6. Support for Elasticsearch 7 for Rados Gateway. So currently we're doing version 6. 7's been out just a little while now. Custom metadata fields for tagging, elastic queries to analyze common system faults. These are the kind of things that we're thinking about from a Ceph cluster perspective when it comes to Ceph Manager. Are you guys familiar with Ceph Manager? Some of you. Ceph Manager really, some of the roots of it come from OpenAttic, which was a company that SUSE acquired a few years back. And we donated that upstream. And all that work now has been turned into Ceph Manager. All of the developers that came from OpenAttic, they work for SUSE and are developing on SUSE Manager now. I'm sorry, Ceph Manager now. So all that work now being done is now going into that Ceph dashboard. So some of these search capabilities that I talked about here today, you'll see some of that go into the Ceph dashboard, or what we call the Ceph Manager. So it'll take some time before you start seeing, some of the alerting capabilities, the AI ops that's built into it. But we're really pushing for a lot of that stuff in our next release of SUSE Enterprise Storage, which will be based off of the Mimic release of Ceph. So there'll be some really neat things that show up there. But that's not the end of it. We're going to continue to grow that. But you're not going to see everything there, unfortunately. It's not a tool today that's going to give you that multi-petabyte, logging capability and Rados Gateway search capability. You really need to tie that into what we've talked about here today. And then, of course, the bigger picture that I talked about earlier. If you want to take the ELK stack or your ELK stack or whatever route you go and turn that more into a machine learning environment, tying on, extra components from the elastic stack or maybe from a public cloud with Microsoft, doing more machine learning on your data. That, of course, is going to, grow your entire your Elasticsearch environment. So that's going to expand. If you want to contribute, here's some links here. The Ceph upstream community, getting involved with mailing lists and the IRC channels, talking with those folks that are out there. You'll see several SUSE engineers out there. We have several technical leads in the Ceph space that are working there. Deep Sea, if you want to learn more about what's going on there from a user operator perspective for Ceph. SUSE is very much involved in making it easy for the operators or your storage administrators, especially at a petabyte scale. We care a lot about that, making sure that it's easy for you to really take advantage of this technology and use this in your environment. And then, of course, questions. I do have a demo that's being worked on, and it will be published on YouTube. I have some other places I'm going to be actually sharing the same presentation at in California in a month's time frame down there at Cloud Expo. So I'll have some stuff available for that as well. But any questions at this point? Yes?
When you talk about using an ELK or stack in combination with Graylog, is there a particular order that you recommend that, or configuration? Is it deploy ELK with like your Kubernetes cluster and then forward everything into Graylog, or select, filter? What are you recommending?
So good question. So I should have diagrammed that. So that's I'll enhance that. But so the question is about how do you go about fitting in your ELK stack and your Graylog together? Am I right? Your ELK stack and your Graylog together. How would you design that? So essentially, what you would do is you would send your Ceph logs to Graylog, and Graylog then can export that to Elasticsearch. And then you also have your Rados Gateway side, which is then exporting to Elasticsearch. So you can use the same Elasticsearch, or you can have two separate clusters. That's completely up to you. Elasticsearch scales really, really well. I don't see any issue with using the same one from a logging perspective. But Graylog is going to be using the Elasticsearch for the logging capabilities, yeah.
You mentioned like the logging side of the Ceph. Is there, or you have, or you also recommend on the metrics side for monitoring?
Okay, so monitoring. Yeah, so
nowadays, matrix oriented, there are kind of two separate things.
yeah.
Logging and metrics.
Yep.
Something that can fit into Prometheus and
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up Prometheus because that's beautiful. In fact, OpenAttic was actually designed to use. It was designed to use what were we using? It'll come to me later, but we had some graphing built in. And in fact, the Ceph Manager, if you haven't seen the newest one yet, it does have the graphing for metrics. It does metrics gathering for the entire cluster now. So you'll see all that in the standard Ceph Manager now, if you look at the latest version upstream. That will also be in SUSE's latest version that's coming out in a few months. That's based on Mimic. So you'll see that.
to
Yeah, we will be using Prometheus on the SUSE side. It's all Prometheus based. Yep. So that'll give you some nice alerting, with the different metrics gathering that it's doing there. A nice operational tool. So, any other questions? If you've got any more, you can come up here and ask me anything you want. Ceph related. Thank you. Thanks for coming.